Welcome to the Len Guillot podcast, the podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Dr. Vanessa Riley. Dr. Riley loves numbers and letters. She holds a doctorate degree in mechanical engineering, and she is the author of over 25 novels. She writes romances and historical fiction on multicultural communities. And today we will speak about her latest work, Iceland Queen, a historical novel based on the true life story of Dorothy Kirwan Thomas, a free woman of color who rose from slavery to be one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in the colonial West Indies. Dr. Riley, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Elaine, for having me.
So I'm just so curious how a mechanical engineer ends up writing so many romance novels.
You got to have something to do with your time, I suppose. Like you said, I love numbers, I love words, and my mother was very, very clear. She's like, baby, you need to be able to pay your bills. And mathematics definitely pays the bills. So
Right.
all the boys and girls out there, go to school, get your doctorate in mechanical engineering or something to the effect. You will always be able to pay your bills.
I was tempted to study accounting with numbers as well in order to be sure that I will be able to pay the bills as well. But okay, can you tell us a little bit about your heritage as well? First of all, where are you right now? Where are you from? And then we go into the topic of the book.
I currently live in Georgia, in Atlanta, one of the lovely suburbs. Often people see my Instagram. I'm on my porch, is traditional veranda type Southern porch where I write. I do a lot of writing. My mother is from South Carolina, and from there we can trace her heritage back to Europe, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. My father is was from Port of Spain, Trinidad. So I am a Trini girl. My love of history comes from him. My love of words comes from my mother.
Okay, you dance reggae, calypso. What you dance?
All of it badly.
I love me some Caribbean food. That drives me. Okay, so you study mechanical engineering, and at what moment, or I guess, was it always that at the same time you felt attracted towards writing? When did you start writing?
Like I said, I'd written as a teenager. Was always scribbling in notebooks. And in college and for the companies I work for, I was always writing technical manuals. So I'm writing about laser dispositions and car moldings, et cetera, et cetera. But when you have this thing for writing, it doesn't go away. It tries to manifest it in other forms, but nothing is as satisfying as sitting down and writing. And I had a difficult pregnancy, and my doctor told me I had to sit down, do nothing, absolutely nothing for 4 or 5 months. That was like going to make me go crazy. My husband wonderfully brings down a box of books, and it has some of my old notebooks. And I'm like looking at it, I'm like, I could do this better. I know more stuff. And that was it. You get in there and you're writing these stories. Once again, my father's the love of history. I am completely fascinated by the world of between 1750 to about 1830. So much change. Everything is going on. And romance was the first avenue because there's so much history you have to know to do a historical fiction. There's just piles and piles and piles of history. With historical romance, you can ease into it. You have to know the world, you have to know the settings, but you can pick and choose events that you want to highlight. When you're doing historical fiction, in my world, you have to know it all. So I have to know British history, Spanish history, French history, because all of the Portuguese, Dutch, because they're all colonizing the West Indies, and that's my central focus.
Right. Okay. And you had this pregnancy, and you start thinking that you can do better. When do you get the courage to say, not only I can do better, but I'm going to publish my first book or novel?
Oh, I was crazed. I thought I wrote it and I sent it in and got some wonderful rejection letters instantly because you don't know what you don't know, right? After that, it took some time. I learned about the craft. I went to classes, took books. And so that was so this journey took about 6 years. And started professionally, querying again around 2009. My first book was accepted for publication in 2013, my first traditional deal. So it was a little bit of a journey from that whole thing, because there's a lot, just writing has changed a lot from when I was in school. There is more, you get more creative license to really characterize, but you have to really pay attention to points of view. There's so much, there's technical things that the reader doesn't notice, but they do notice, because it'll make them leap out of the story. And so learning those techniques, building that in with my love of history and words, that took a moment, that took time. And now I think I've got it, and we're out here and we're publishing books, and it's exciting.
Perfect. So can you define for the listeners what exactly is historical fiction?
Historical fiction is, you are taking events in history and you are creating a narrative to explain what is going on, to center the reader in that time and space. What I love to do is biographical historical fiction. So I find a person, someone who hasn't been talked about that much, but who was integral in the fabric of history. Dorothy Kerman Thomas is an example of this. She's a woman who was actually famous during her day. And then all the records of her gets put away, and we don't know her name. And she's a name that we should know. So, but with Dorothy, she's born in Montserrat. She lives in various islands and colonies, building businesses. You've got to know about these colonies. You've got to know that fabric of what's going on. I mean, she's in the middle of all the different revolutions and big revolts that are happening in the West Indies during this time frame. So you have to know the politics of the land. You've got to overlay all that, because it gives the richness of her story, and it helps understand what's going on, what's being said. And so historical fiction is better than a textbook. And it gives you motivations of why people are doing what they, so you can better understand, because sometimes we look at from a 21st century point of view. We want to put our value system on what was happening in the world. We try and choose our own victims and villains and heroes, et cetera, et cetera. And you often find there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray in history of what was acceptable during that time, what's et cetera, and the choices and motivations. So biographical historical fiction, or historical fiction, puts you there. It centers the reader, and it tries to explain why people are doing and moving in what they're the manner of history.
Okay, so can you put us in the context of Dorothy in relations to the United States? When was she born? And she was born as a slave. How is slavery different in the Caribbean island as slavery different in the States? And also, she bought her freedom. Could that have been possible in the United States?
There are cases of that happening in the United States. But it was more so the massa or master who owns the slaves. He has to be more willing to want this to happen. So he's kind of almost an advocate of the enslaved person, and he allows the conditions to happen. In the West Indies, it's a little bit more formalized system. There still has to be a negotiation of the price, but everything goes back to these fees that have to be paid to the government in order to register that you are now a free person. So it's a little bit, I don't want to use the word orderly, but it's more of a system in the West Indies, and more so than I had been aware of in the United States. The conditions of being free are all different depending upon who colonized you. So if you go to Santo Domingo, which is present day Haiti, if you had a baby with your master and he claims this child, you and the child are instantly free. That was from the Code Noirs, which is the French society, from the colonies that the French inhabited. If you go to the British-based colonies and in the Dutch ones, there was a set price you paid the manumission fees, and then one was free, and it was actually registered, and you were given papers, and you would take those to various. I had not seen this level of system in the United States. So to me, they're very different. It's not to say that one way is better than the other, because enslavement pretty much sucks across the board. But it's to say that we cannot use one brush and say this is how it was in the entirety of the world. Every place is different, and it's once again going back to looking what's going on. What are the politics that are going on? Because the French politics in French-based colonies is different than Dutch, than different than Spanish, than different than Portuguese, than different than the British. And they all make the rules differently. The context of Dorothy, the American, when she's born, the American War hasn't even, colonizing is it from going from Europe to the Americas is still happening. She lives through the mini wars, from the 7 Years War, the American War, through the War of 1812, and they all affect her life differently. 1812, has blockades. So goods that were coming to Europe, travel that was coming to Europe, it actually sends one of her daughters to Granada at the wrong, unfortunately, the wrong time for the daughter. But these things are affecting her life. The thing I love about history, or the more I delve into it, is it's really a much smaller world. They know what's going on in Europe. They know about the French Revolution. They know about the Haitian revolutions. They know about the American revolutions. Everything is connected, and it's affecting them in trade, or it's affecting their economies, or just in, once again, the laws of how someone is going to be free and stay free.
Wow, this is this is so much information. Okay, so
I'm sorry.
so in the United States, it's still being colonized. It's been so it's almost like an unfair comparison to say how was slavery in the Caribbean as opposed to how was in the States, because the States is still expanding. But can you describe anyway how was the typical life of a slave in the West Indies? And just for your information, I had a guest in my podcast. His name is Alex Renton, and he wrote a book called Blood Legacy, where he's describing how his ancestors were slave owners and how their business was run, and the limited life expectancy of the slave at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the average slave lived about 30-35. Men were pretty much, if they lived at 30, that was a long time. The conditions are horrible. And once again, the islands at these points, they're all different. You've got in San Domingo, you have to watch out for yellow fever. The climate is such that yellow fever can kill 10 to 20,000 in a year, just during the seasons. You go to Granada, you've got the bugs. You have Boulam fever, which is a variant of yellow fever that can also kill. And then you just have pure old-fashioned masses cruelty. As they discovered or figured out that the enslaved population was sometimes 10 to 20 times more than the Blancs, the whites, the colonizers, there was fear that an uprising would take their livelihood, burn their plantations or habitations down, or kill them. So instead of trying to make the conditions better, they oftentimes made things worse and tried to make everything an example. So I have read things about sugar deaths that horrify me. It's a system of oppression. You have people who are taken against their will, being forced to work horrid conditions, long conditions. At different points, Britain tries to do ameliorative codes to mandate that people go have a day off. I was like, how do you have a day off in slavery? That's just me thinking 21st century. How do you have a day off from slavery? I don't know. But they were trying to mandate a day off. try to keep the church Wednesday nights for church. They try and make civilized to because the masters of these plantations are so cruel. They're trying to legislate the way they should act. But it's an incredibly difficult life. There are oftentimes where enslaved were hungry. They weren't given enough provisions to eat. Harshly dressed. For the climate. It is not a great condition. Now there are quote unquote better, and I put that in quote, better masters who realized that if they treated their enslaved people better, they would get more productivity. So they did spend over their allotments in clothing, etc. But they would often get chastised by other plantation owners. Look at what you're doing. That's looking badly on us. My enslaved people are going to want this too. And so they would put pressure on the others so that everybody has the same sin. Everybody's doing things the exact same way. I found that prevalent across the colonies in the West Indies, more so than I'd seen this type of collusion in the United States.
Can you talk a little bit about how this slavery is keeping people in England rich and prosperous, and how the direct relationship between the wealth and the opulent life in England versus the terrible life that these people are living in the West Indies?
Yeah, absolutely. When I started doing some of this research, we call it the sugar trade. Sounds so sweet, right? Sugar trade, sugar and tea and coffee and indigo. Well, that's powering 80% of the economies, particularly in England. And you will read, when I read literature now, particularly like you read Jane Austen, and in Mansfield Park, one of the characters has to keep going back to his plantations in Antigua because his lifestyle is now threatened. So there you have a lot of absentee owners. They have these plantations across the West Indies, and they're expecting certain amounts of money to come back from them. So they leave commandors or drivers, slave drivers in place to manage these things. And these people are cruel. They're all only look about efficiency. But based on the wars, the economies, prices of sugars are sometimes dropping. They're not getting the money, they're out. And that affects their lifestyle. So if you want to live in the expensive places in London, your plantations have to be bringing you certain income. And when it's not, you go to those islands. And so when you read some of these pieces that are written between 1750, 1830, and you hear them having to go take care of business in the West Indies, they're going to their plantations to try and fix a problem, put in new management, etc., because their lifestyles, 80% of their money is coming, 80% of the dollars of the world are coming from the enslaved in the West Indies.
Okay, well, this is what I don't understand. In a world so cruel, how and so full of racism, I can understand someone like Dorothy being able to buy her freedom due to whatever she has to do in order to achieve that. But to go beyond that and become one of the wealthiest women in the Caribbean, how, I mean, I don't expect you to tell us your whole book, but help us understand. And because as I read about racial discrimination in the South and the United States, even if a person had the talent and the smarts to get ahead in life, the discrimination is so horrible that becomes almost impossible. So in this case, a woman, how, tell us her secret. Maybe today we can learn some of her skills.
The West Indies is different than any other place in the world. More women are freed in the West Indies than any other place in the world. Now you gotta ask yourself, why is that? You go back to the climate, you go back to this, you're on these islands and you're separated from the rest of the world. It's almost like you're almost in another world. And so people look at people differently. Dorothy was a mulatto woman. She was dark skinned. She was all the things, if you look at the stereotypes, she is not the one I would assume to have this level of agency. But there was something about her. I read these papers talking about how great of a conversationalist she was. She sparkled, and I think they're just these people that people are drawn to. Dorothy was one of them. And Dorothy was extremely smart. She knew math. She figured out that the housekeeping system was the way to get rich, because you have all of these Navy ships coming to the islands. They're not going to own slaves because they're only there for, a couple of months, et cetera, et cetera. They're not going to go through all of this. So they would hire people to housekeep for them. And these housekeepers would, clean, cook, et cetera, and remove bugs. Because remember, I told you about the bugs. So they were very nice to these housekeepers, paid them very well. And Dorothy organized this system of housekeepers throughout the thing. So she was making money on that. And the people that she was working for or in relationships with, they taught her things about European culture. They taught her things so that she made sure her housekeepers were like the best housekeepers. So when you came to the colonies, you were looking for one of Dorothy's girls. So she was making large amounts of money by giving women opportunities to cook safely, cook and clean for these military men, et cetera, throughout the colony. And she was able to replicate that model from Demerara, which is present day Guyana. She replicated it in Dominique, and she replicated it in Grenada. So you have a woman, and she's not the only one. There are I found at least a dozen women similarly who in different colonies who've been able to take advantage, and I put that in quotes, of this unique opportunity of providing services and being able to leverage that into really big fortunes. And Dorothy was one of those. And then she went beyond that because she realized, if I build hotels, these Navy guys are going to have a place to stay. These people who were visiting from Europe because it was fashionable to go down to the West Indies and whatnot, they were looking for that same level of elegance. So her hotels were like the best hotels and whatnot. So she took it, she was able to capitalize on her experiences in such a way that she was able to make money. And she saved up enough money, and she had other people, she was smart enough to have other people do the negotiations. So she had, she used solicitors, she used friends, et cetera, et cetera. They did a negotiation for her. So she often just showed up at the table with the money to make these exchanges.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned a minute ago that we cannot judge people in the past by our values of today. And Dorothy herself, she had a big crew, but this crew, some of them were slaves. She became a slave owner as well, right? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So when I was writing the book, the one thing I didn't want to do was make her into a saint. Dorothy was not a saint. She's not a superwoman. She was extremely human, but she also had a fear of being re-enslaved, because other people could get into debt and go to debtor's prison and be released. A Black person during that time frame would go to debtor's prison, but then could be re-enslaved as a way of repaying these debts. And to me, that was her fear. When you look at Demerara, when free men of color owned plantations but refused to use enslaved labor, they were run out of business by the other plantation owners. One of Dorothy's son-in-laws was run out of business because of his faith. He was Jewish. And the colonial men want every last one of the other plantation owners to worship the same God and have the same standards when it comes to employment. So I look at Dorothy having two choices. Am I going to be run out of business because I'm trying to be different? Or am I going to potentially use enslavement to help these people? Because if I own them, I'm not raping them. I'm providing them a method of being free, because it took Dorothy about 17 years to get free, of saving money in order to do this. And I believe that was the path she was having the people that she purchased, because she knew that the world wasn't changing fast enough. She knew that emancipation would come, but it wasn't moving fast enough. So what do you do? So I think she was one of those who decided, I will have a seat at the table and use that seat to make influence. Once again, I don't condone what she did, but I understand why she did it, because of, particularly in Demerara, the way the colonial assembly and the other plantation owners went after anybody who was different.
Right. In the United States, slavery was abolished after the Civil War. But in the West Indies, slavery was abolished when, what is it, with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833,
Yep.
which compensated slave owners for their slave. So as opposed to going to war as in the United States, here the British government says, here's a paycheck, you liberate now your property. And she got compensated for that as well. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. See, it goes back to my theory. Dorothy and some of the other women of the Entertainment Society, these other free women of color, owned the most slaves in Demerara. If you look at the number they owned and the amount of land that they own, it doesn't make sense. So what is she really doing? She's using, she and her buddies are using their money, their spare money, to just buy enslaved people so that other people don't enslave them.
Wow.
And she's teaching them huckstering so they have a methodology so they can go out and save money and be able to be a part of this economy without ever being re-enslaved. So like I said, to me, it makes sense what she was doing. But she didn't leave a diary around. This is, based on mathematics, which we started with. She was an extremely charismatic, brilliant woman. She was flawed. She did some crazy things. But I think at the end of the day, when she needed to be her best self, she was. She fought for, women's rights. She was able to get taxes rescinded that were targeting women of color. And I think her grand plan was, figuring out how to defeat enslavement until they had emancipation come.
Okay, last question. So there it is. She's an ex-slave, and you open their book with London 1824, where she's going to London. I wonder how Black people were received when they were going to the capital. What was, a Black person from the South going to New York, let's say, which was a free state. There was still a certain amount of racism. And I assume the same was going on in London, but she seems to be welcomed with a lot of respect. So can you tell us what was it like to be a Black person going back to London?
When you had money, the world changed. So I want everybody to say this together. Money trumps race. Dorothy in London, she went several times to London. One time, she actually had 17 grandkids with her. So think about that. From Demerara, she's taken 17 of her grandkids all the way to Glasgow, Scotland, putting a couple of them in schools there. And then she goes to London, where she's one of the founding paying money for this school for colored girls in London. Money trumps everything. She was known to be a great dresser. So she's dealing with the people who are the haberdashers and whatnot. The big scene nearing the end of the book where she rents a carriage with 6 horses, this monstrous carriage with 6 horses to pull up in front of Whitehall, is true. She moved in and she commanded the space because money is the great equalizer. And money trumped everything. That's why her partners or the men who liked her, money made a difference. And it changes the color rules. So even if in the South, if somebody here, from those times translates to the South and they're going with money, they're not going the typical routes. They're going the way every other rich person is going to be getting to these other places. And that speaks to it. And, you learn what services to use, who's going to cater to you. she was extremely good. And she had people on the ground there. Some of the biggest financiers are her friends.
Wow.
And they're help setting things up for her. So once she's a remarkable woman. I do not know why on this earth she was erased. Her will is archived in the UK.
Wow.
She was famous. She was absolutely famous and
she was erased for two reasons, because she was a woman and because she was of color as well. I mean, I can, of course.
I agree. I mean, it's sad to say, but yeah. And I think if growing up, you especially girls like me growing up, knowing that there's this woman who defied the odds, who figured out how to build businesses, who figured out how to navigate a world when the world is against you because of your color and your race and where you were born. And think about it. She was enslaved. That's like all the taboos. But she figured out how to move forward and to excel. And I wish she needs to be known in our vernacular. She needs to be known.
Well, I have read tons of books about race and equality and slavery related to the United States. This is perhaps the second one that I read in regards to slavery in the Caribbean, in the West Island. I recommend to my listeners that to broaden their lens of view, to check out your book, because it's just astonishing, and the amount of things that I learned is just it's huge. So my last question, of course, is, can you tell us one last time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do? Because I know that you're going to continue writing many, many, many more books.
Thank you so much. My name is Vanessa Riley. The book is called Island Queen. If you go to my website, vanessariley.com, you can see links. The book is available everywhere. It's in audiobook form. I think Hungry just purchased a translation of the book. It's going to be very exciting. And you're right, there are more books coming out. Next year, she'll be my second historical fiction called Sister Mother Warrior, the two women who shaped the Haitian Revolution.
Oh, we have to talk about that. But I like to close with a comment that your audiobook is, I listened to a sample of it, and the voice artist is just amazing how she does all this accent. Oh, extraordinary. Oh,
yeah. Angela Ando is amazing. She does the audio for Harper Audio. She is absolutely fabulous. And she's signed on board to be one of the executive producers for Island Queen if it's going to be made into a television series.
Wow. Okay. Well, Vanessa, I'm so thankful for your time. And listeners, please check out this book. The audio form, perhaps better than the written form. I don't care. You just have to check it out. Goodbye, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.